war, and it's making us more and more unsafe all the time.
I welcome you to the event of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament of the International Peace Bureau, where we want to remember one of the great fighters for peace, Bruce Kent. Born the 22nd of June, 1929, he left us on June 8th, 2022. We want to remember his life, his activism, his tremendously importance for the national and international peace movement. He was the president of IPB for a very long period, from 68 to 74, and from 74 to 85. He was awarded with the IPB MacBride Award. My name is Rainer Braun. I'm the Executive Director of the International Peace Bureau. And together with Kate Hudson, we would like to lead you through the next hours. Kate, the floor is to you.
Thanks very much to you, Rainer, for organising this event, and a big welcome to everyone joining us here today. I think I can say that over the last month, everyone has been inundated here with the most wonderful messages of love and solidarity and support from all over the world. I know Valerie, Bruce's wife, and their family, they've been just overwhelmed with support and love, because Bruce himself was a man of great commitment, great dedication, great energy, but also of great love as well. And one of the things that Valerie said at the funeral, the marvellous, wonderful funeral that was held on Monday in London, she said that Bruce was truly a man of peace, justice, and love. And that came out in his work. He was never motivated by hatred and wanting to destroy things. He was motivated by his faith and his very, very deep love of humanity. And it was that which enabled him to be the most extraordinary leader of CND, particularly during the 1980s, when we and the world itself was faced with this terrible challenge, the impending nuclear conflict, and of course the bringing of nuclear weapons, further nuclear weapons to Europe in the form of cruise and Pershing missiles. I know the movement in Germany, Rainer, had a massive mobilization against these weapons, and in other countries. And in Britain, that struggle was tremendous. It was one of the greatest political struggles in our country ever, I think. And Bruce was at the head of that, and his outstanding personal qualities, his inclusivity, his determination, his wisdom and good judgment, and also his determination never to be knocked back. You know, he was under immense attack, as CND was, but he always rose to those challenges and prevailed. And that enabled him to take our organisation from just a few thousand members at the end of the 1970s through the 80s into an organisation of hundreds of thousands of people. And of course, he was a household name. Everyone knew Bruce Kent. So losing Bruce is a great sadness for us, but also his legacy is so powerful. He's influenced and affected the lives of so many people, and we will carry that forward. Thanks, Rainer, and back to you.
We are coming now to one of these last big speeches from Bruce Kent. It was at the birthday party of the International Peace Bureau, where IPB become 130 years old.
Does it really?
The chair of IPB from 1985 to 1992. Until today, he is on all stages and floors where people are active for peace. Bruce Kent, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Rainer.
Greetings to everybody who has gathered here today to celebrate the birthday of the IPB. I ought to have lots of memories, but at 92, my brain has passed its best. So I'm not going to give you an IPB history. Read instead the book, 100 Years of Peacemaking, which I'll show you later on. Like many of you, perhaps, I took time to wake up to the peace movement. After a conventional British schooling with its militarist bias, I did my national service in the army. It was the moral issue of nuclear weapons that got me thinking more deeply. I became chaplain to Pax Christi, the Catholic peace organization, and eventually a leader in the campaign for nuclear disarmament. I can't remember exactly, but that must have been my introduction also to the IPB. I am proud to have been associated with the IPB for many reasons. What stands out? Well, first of all, IPB does have a fascinating history, dotted with pioneers like Baroness Bertha von Suttner, who persuaded Alfred Nobel to get involved in peacemaking. For over 30 years, 130 years, IPB can be proud of its stand on winning the right to conscientious objection, on the illegality of nuclear weapons. I'm very proud of IPB's pioneering work, making connections between issues, development, disarmament, and the environment. This aspect of unity is something for which Colin Archer, in particular, can take much credit. Perhaps above all, IPB must be proud of its role as the primary network for the global peace movement and for bringing people together from all over the world. The Hague, Barcelona, Berlin, and on so many other occasions to discuss vital issues and campaigns. In recent days, I've been looking through my photograph albums and promising myself once again that I really must sort them out properly and label everything. But they remind me of so many wonderful occasions and people I have met through the IPB. Photos of our meetings in Crete in 1986, and a walk I took from Vézelay in France to Geneva in Switzerland in the 1990s, to name but a two. Don't know what you're saying.
A bit louder.
The peace movement has certainly changed my life and taken me to many parts of the world. New York, Moscow, Nagasaki, Helsinki, Dublin, Sweden, Norway and Australia, and more. And all have been at different times on my agenda, often because of my IPB connections. I can't count how many times I've visited the office in Geneva, and how many good friends I have met through there, and how many impressive people around the world. The best known, I think, would be Seán MacBride, the Irish statesman and one-time IRA activist who had his own way of chairing meetings. If someone went on speaking for longer than Seán thought reasonable, he would take his hearing aids out of his ears and put them on the table in front of him and look up at the ceiling. The speaker got the point usually and came to an end. I remember once looking out, this is quite touching, it moves me a lot, looking out of a hotel window in Stockholm late on a dark snowy night and seeing Seán trudging through the snow alone back to his hotel. He was then in his 80s and as determined as ever, one of the best of the IPB. If you are looking for an IPB history, I can warmly recommend 100 Years of Peacemaking, written by Rainer Santi, once on the IPB staff. It was published in 1991. He concluded his book by saying that we now live effectively in a single economic system, which has become now a single ecological system. That was in 1991. If COVID has taught us anything, it is that if our world is to survive, we have to make it clear that we all depend on one another, whatever our race, religion, or culture. There are those here today listening and taking part who can take the IPB into the future. Plenty of work remains for all of us and the IPB to do in the next 130 years. Love to you all, and good wishes to everybody, and thank you for all you do. Bye.
Okay, so that was very, very good to hear from Bruce. I hadn't seen that message before, so it makes me want to learn about the history of IPB, to be honest. Amazing. So now we're going to turn to our first speaker, and it's a real pleasure and honour for me to welcome Meg Beresford. The people who worked with Bruce during the 1980s are the people who knew best, I think, about his great qualities. And Meg worked alongside Bruce when he was chair, and Meg was General Secretary of CND. So big welcome to you, Meg. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes,
Loud and clear.
Well, funnily enough, about 10 days before Bruce died, I thought, I'm going to talk to him on the telephone. And I got my phone book out and I rang him up, and we had a lovely long telephone conversation, and remembering a lot of things in our life together. And it was a wonderful thing to suddenly hear him talk. And age 92, I'm going to be 85 this year. So that's just useful by comparison. But when I first met Bruce, this goes back to 1980. I was a student doing a PhD, and I'd just been to the United States, and I had taken an interest in the nuclear power station at 3 Mile Island. And I heard this incredible talks by Ralph Nader and Jane Fonda. And I thought that Staten Island was going to sink because there were so many people there. And I had never seen so many people. And I came back and I got on. I thought, oh God, can I get on with my PhD? And then they made the decision about cruise and Pershing missiles. And I was a student in Oxford. And they had organized a meeting in one of the halls in Oxford, which I went to. And there were probably 20 people there, if that. And we went and we saw this man sitting there, grey hair, sitting, smiling and being very friendly and talking. And at the end of that meeting, I thought, my goodness me, I've got to do something. And that is one of the most fantastic things about Bruce. He was able to talk to all kinds of different people and get them involved in the most extraordinarily wonderful way. And we sat there and we listened to him talking about the cruise missiles, which were going to go to Upper Hayford, we thought, which was about 15 miles north of Oxford down Greenham Common. And we thought, we've got to do something. And so a friend of mine who'd also been at Warwick University and I talked after that, and we thought, let's ring Edward Thompson up. So we did. And Edward Thompson invited us to lunch. This is another character like Bruce, who he got very involved in not very long after, when Edward started European nuclear disarmament. And we thought, yeah, you've got to come up. I'm writing a book. I'm writing a book called Protest and Survive, which I have got a copy of, and Bruce has got a chapter in it. And we just felt we've got to do something. And we organised a walk from Oxford to Upper Hayford, and Bruce, among other people, came, and I had to speak. And I was so nervous, I didn't think I was going to be able to speak in public at this demonstration. And I had to sit down, and I got somebody else to write my speech for me. Absolutely ridiculous. But at that point, I got totally involved in campaigning. and got involved. I started working for European Nuclear Disarmament, which Bruce was also involved in. It doesn't get mentioned all that often, but it was an important group of people who were getting people to think about what we needed to do. And lots of members of parliament, people like Robin Cook and Marjorie Mallum and so forth, were involved in it, and it spread. And that was a very good changing point in my life. But if it hadn't been for Bruce making that absolutely remarkable speech in that funny little hall in Oxford, I wouldn't have been sitting there. And I became friends with him because we lived not far from each other. He lived in Islington and I lived in Stoke Newington, and I could walk from where I lived and go to his house if he needed any help and get shopping and things for him. And then when the time came for him to move out, when he stopped living in a Catholic home, I helped him, I packed him up and helped him with his move. And we became incredibly good friends. And I got involved with CND, and we used to have our meetings in a town hall in Islington, where who should come to get his coffee and stuff like that but Jeremy Corbyn. Yeah, you know, he was there. He was just taking our stuff. But Bruce would just welcome people like that. And that was one of the most incredible things I found about him, was that he was a welcoming of people of all ages. And he was very happy to go on these incredible demonstrations. When we had END, we had demonstrations in places like Amsterdam, and he would think nothing of traveling to places like that and taking part in demonstrations and speaking from the platforms. And I can remember him talking. I took my two young sons and he just sort of bent down and smiled at them, and they felt that they were valued. And that is one of the most extraordinary things about Bruce, is that he valued all the people that he talked to. And he was great for people of all ages. And another extraordinary idea, we were up at Faslane, up in Scotland, which was another very important nuclear place. And I suddenly got this bright idea. I thought, Bruce, why don't we get a walk from Faslane to Aldermaston? And I told him, I said it to him, and he looked at me as if I was mad. And then he smiled and he said, yes, I'll do that. And he did. He walked. It took him quite a long time, and he had a young pair of people who walked with him to help him with this journey. And they walked all the way across the south of Scotland to the east coast of England and all the way down, and landed up, I think, at Burfield Common, if I've got that right. I thought, when I first suggested it, I thought Aldermaston is the place, but he landed up at Burfield Common. And they stopped every night, and they met people, and they talked, and they raised a huge amount of money to help with CND, which CND, of course, needed badly to keep itself going. So he was the most. And the other thing I used to do was sort of help him. I'd go into the CND office and help out. And then eventually, when he decided that he was going to move on to do something different for CND, I got the job. And we have been friends, very good friends. I'm going to stop talking in just a minute, but he was one of the most wonderful people that I have ever come across. And we're very, very lucky to have known him. Thank you so much.
Meg, thank you so much for these impressive words and these picture you create from Bruce Kent. And I think when we were talking, we all feel that he was really near to us and to our work. I would like to give the floor now to the former chair of CND, who for many, many years worked together with Bruce Kent. They had many political and private events, and I remember quite often they were standing together and have everyone a glass of beer in his hands. I love to give the floor now to Dave. Dave, the floor is to you.
Thank you very much, Rainer, and thank you for asking me along today. It's a sad occasion, but actually a wonderful occasion to remember all those fantastic times we had with Bruce, the wonderful speeches he gave. He had a magnificent way of being able to mix the everyday with the truly profound. So he could speak to you in kind of everyday language, but really get to the core of what he was about, really, which was the peace message. I remember first meeting him. He won't remember, well, he won't remember now, but he wouldn't remembered anyway. I came up to, or came down, I'm living in Yorkshire, came down to CND office in London to get some materials, and he happened to be there somewhere. I had my little son on my shoulders. He was, I don't know how old he was, but very young. Now he's in his late 30s and just had a daughter, a son of his own. So that's how long ago it was. But he was just, Bruce was so welcoming. He welcomed me. He spoke to me as if he'd known me all his life. I hadn't met him before. And of course, he paid attention to Sam on my shoulders as well. And I don't know, there's such a great impression from just a few moments seeing him. This chap who I knew from news headlines, I knew from CND materials and so on. And he took the trouble to do that just for us. It was a great time. And then I got to know him eventually as chair of CND. He offered me his couch for CND council meetings, so I would stay over the weekends. And he always wanted to know what was going on, what the gossip was at CND, just as he was interested in what the gossip was in IPB as well, of course. But I'm sure we'll get to that too. He wanted to know what was going on outside of the meeting, what people were saying, what people were doing, and all that kind of thing. And he'd come along to council meetings when he could, but he couldn't always make it, and he could only stay for a short time usually. But as Rainer has said, he was always willing to have a glass of beer, or in the evenings, he'd close the evening with a brandy perhaps. So very welcoming, very hospitable. Valerie was very hospitable too, of course. I don't know how much choice she had in the matter, but she was lovely as well, of course, and still is. And my thoughts go to her and the rest of the family as well. There's been something in the chat which was about he had many honours bestowed upon him, of course. And one of them was an honorary doctorate from Coventry University in November last year. And they awarded him as more President Emeritus and Vice President of CND and Pax Christi and IPB and so on. And in his address, he spoke of how it took him a very long time to wake up from his safe middle-class background, which he spoke of in that clip we saw, where a military culture was part and parcel of his education. And he had this light bulb moment, which came when he met a Jesuit archbishop called Thomas Roberts. He was almost on his own at that time in rejecting nuclear weaponry. And he asked Bruce once if he thought it was wrong to kill hundreds of thousands of innocent people. Of course, said Bruce promptly. But do you also think it's wrong to be willing to do just that? He was asking about the so-called nuclear deterrence. And this question made Bruce think again. And this was one of Bruce's great strengths, his ability and willingness to think about the morality of situations and to question perhaps traditional norms. And he said to the students gathered at this meeting, please think for yourselves. Don't be swept along by whatever happens to be the propaganda of the day. Ask your own critical questions. Why are people risking their lives trying to cross the channel in small boats? Why freezing in woods facing Polish barbed wire? Why is it okay for charities to raise money for war victims in Yemen, but not okay for them to ask why Britain is selling bombs to Saudi Arabia? He was really one of our finest and most popular public speakers and orators. He was a warm human being, a wonderful man. I had a great honor to call myself a friend of his, I think. I don't know what right I have to such a great man to be a friend, but I think he thought of everybody as a friend. He treated everybody as a friend, treated them as if he'd known them for a very long time. Wonderful man. And although, you know, we can't all be Bruce Kents, unfortunately, we can carry on with his work and do the best we can to fulfill his dreams of a nuclear-free world and a peaceful world without war. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Dave, for these words and for remembering us of the common activities you had with Bruce. You know, the next speaker I would like to introduce is someone who met Bruce Kent 2019 when IPB was giving the MacBride Award to Bruce Kent. And Philip Jennings makes the Laudatio speech. And the amazing event of this speech was that the whole evening, Bruce and Philip were staying together in one corner of the building and don't allow anyone to interfere them or to interrupt them. They had so many things to tell with each other that everyone else was without any sense in this room. So it's a great pleasure to me to give now the floor to one of the presidents of the International Peace Bureau, to Philip Jennings. Philip, the floor is to you.
Thank you, Rainer, and welcome everybody. And thank you, IPB and CND, for organizing this event. And for all of you that were in London in 29, I do express my apologies. It was my first meeting with Bruce Kent. He was 90 years old, and I had an awful lot of catching up to do. And as a former president of the IPB, I had to learn from him his approach to the job and what he thought my priorities should be and how I should do things. And that memory of that evening stays with me. Today, on behalf of the IPB, I want to express our appreciation and gratitude to one of our legends, Bruce Kent. We also express our sympathy and love to Valerie, to family, and his friends. His loss has resulted in an outpouring of global sympathy, and worldwide, the IPB family mourn his passing. An extraordinary man that led an extraordinary life with a simple and dignified message to all humanity to live in peace. It's a message that we continue to hold to our hearts and will continue to reassure and inspire us as the flames of war, threats of using nuclear weapons, and growing militarization remind us all once again in this world on edge to remain, as he would have wished, steadfast in our quest for peace. As Bruce said, for us to be active, not passive, to ask the questions now. Martin Luther King said, our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. Bruce Kent did not remain silent about things that matter. And with his passing, we promise him that at the IPB and our members everywhere will continue along his path to campaign for human rights, for dialogue and cooperation between nations, and to continue, in his words, to criticize the gross and wasteful expenditure on conventional and nuclear arms. It was not just breaking the silence, but action that characterized his life. A leader for peace, transforming the CND, but importantly, building alliances at home and abroad, awakening generations to the threat of nuclear weapons. He made his voice heard at home and internationally. A president of the IPB at the most tense of times at the height of the Cold War. And how happy we were to award him our highest accolade, the Seán MacBride Prize, in his 90th year. We recognize his strength of character. Everyone talks about his genial, welcoming manner, but there was also, as I discovered, an iron will, a determination, and a passionate and convincing orator. He faced down criticism from a wide spectrum, from his own church to government, because he supported détente and peace as million-strong armies, armed with nuclear weapons, face each other in Europe. He was inspired by a devout Austrian farmer, Jans Jägerstätter, who refused to fight in Hitler's war and was executed for his conscientious objection to fighting in Hitler's army. He made pilgrimages to Jägerstätter's village. Now they can embrace together, they can embrace one another, the martyr and the campaigner in their garden of peace. Bruce participated in marches for peace from Warsaw to the NATO HQ in Brussels. In India, Biafra, Greenham Common, protesting at nuclear bases, picketing parliaments, ministries of defense, addressing rallies tens of thousands strong, but also school children in the smallest of classrooms. Vigils for conscientious objectors. And I know how meaningful this is to our Ukrainian friend, Ural in Ukraine, Kiev today. Appealing to the world to fight the causes of injustice, not just its symptoms. For in ignoring the causes of injustice and war, we shortchange the poor, he said. At ease with the media, and this was news to me, rubbing shoulders with rock festival impresarios from Glastonbury. On UK TV, there was recently a documentary on their 50th anniversary, and he told the story about how he won over the Glastonbury family and team, and also winning their financial support. And he did express on television his gratefulness for receiving a check, I think, for £20,000, which at that time was an extraordinary contribution. In the words of John Lewis, the USA Congressman, Bruce Kent led a life making good trouble for peace. It was protesters making good trouble for peace outside his church in London that was his point of entry into the peace movement. On one day, not one of the 5 brides arrived at his church on time as Kensington High Street was blocked with anti-nuclear weapon demonstrators. He was angry about this and asked the question why. And not getting to the church in time resulted in the beginning of his life's engagement with the CND and the IPB. Serious business and commitment, yet lightened by a wonderful sense of humor, which I also discovered. He felt he had reached ultimate celebrity status when someone asked him once, was he once Bruce Kent? Greeting a French peace delegation with a pint of warm English bitter in both hands, bare-chested and wearing Union Jack shorts. The shocked yet jovial delegation leader observing they never expected this behavior or welcome from the Archbishop of Canterbury. Bruce, thank you. There is a new generation taking action that see the twin existential threats of climate change and nuclear weapons. They, as you, are campaigning for the prohibition of nuclear weapons. They are active and asking the questions. Just weeks ago, the First States Parties Conference on the Treaty to Prohibit Nuclear Weapons took place in Vienna. It was the youth present with the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki that spoke of the wickedness of the intention to commit mass murder. How sad your final days witnessed the devastation of the war in Ukraine. And I'm sure these new victims and witnesses to war will generate a new way for peace and non-violent means of resolving conflict. That is all our duties now. Martin Luther King said, finally, the ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he stands at times of challenge and controversy. By Martin Luther King's and our measure, Bruce, you were a giant. We promise you to keep marching and campaigning for peace, and always that we will look forward as we walk in your shoes. Thank you for your attention, and thank you for this opportunity to express my gratitude to him. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Philip, for that moving and profound tribute. And there's so much there in your words. I'm now very pleased to welcome our next speaker. Many of you will know that Bruce was very involved in Pax Christi, the Catholic peace organisation. In fact, he was honoured as a vice president of that organisation. So it's a great pleasure to welcome our next speaker, Anne Farr, who is chair of Pax Christi, England and Wales. Welcome, Anne.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you for all the wonderful memories that we've already heard from everybody. It brings back so many occasions that I know that many of us will have shared with Bruce. And in being asked to do this, how do we choose from all the stories that we have of all the times that we've spent with him? And I'm sure there will be other repetitions as well, but some of the stories that I was thinking of have been mentioned already by others. But having been known for so many years as a campaigner against nuclear weapons and for peace, I'd like to recognise that Bruce had a very rounded approach to his peace work. He was a man of compassion, so deeply concerned about the injustices suffered by others, whether it was the cleaner at the school that he attended, for whom he campaigned to have transport to bring her to work because she had such a long walk from home, or a country such as Biafra that he visited in 1969 during the war. And he saw that it was the people who were the victims of the imposed embargoes. He said, Biafra taught me the importance of fighting the causes of injustice, not just its symptoms. He always noticed and worked for those on the margins. Pax Christi is an international organisation which was started after the First World War. It was started because of a French teacher who took the view that it was important to pray for their enemies, not a popular decision at the time, but it resulted in an international organisation with many groups and sections all over the world now. And Bruce was involved with Pax Christi in the UK since its early days. And he, as somebody's mentioned, he mentioned it himself, was his chaplain. In 1958, there was a small group that was meeting in London to discuss the church's teaching on peace and to promote the international routes, which were marches and pilgrimages across Europe. The objectives were to further peace by fostering international relationships and international friendship. And as a chaplain at London University, he was in a good place to encourage students to take part in those routes and in those hostels. Hard to believe now that most of the members at that time were under 30 years of age. Bruce would frequently give talks about people who had the courage to say no to war. And we've heard about one of them, one of his heroes, Franz Jägerstätter, the Austrian farmer who was executed in 1943 for refusing to fight in Hitler's army. And Franz remains a very significant part of Pax Christi's education work now. And of course, Bruce and Valerie led pilgrimages to their home place and were significantly, I think, movers of the beatification of Franz Jägerstätter. They were privileged also to know Franziska, Franz's wife, and to hear her story of how she supported her husband's work, but then brought up their children in a village that was not supportive of what Franz had done. As recently as May this year, Bruce took part in the annual ceremony in Tavistock Square in London to honour conscientious objectors throughout the world. We all know that Bruce had a great gift for being a networker and for encouraging organisations involved in peace, in development, in human rights, and more recently in climate, to cooperate and draw together the threads that link them. And this work we're trying to do now as well. In recognition of all that he'd done, Bruce was one of the first people to receive our Pax Christi Award in 2001. He would never miss a Pax Christi AGM, and we missed him hugely at the one that took place a couple of weeks ago. He took his role as Vice President very seriously, and he engaged critically with our organisation and spoke frequently in the name of Pax Christi in the public arena. Hearing him speak with clarity and, of course, with humour was an unforgettable experience for so many people, as many of the tributes show. I live in Coventry, as the city of peace and reconciliation, and Bruce visited many times for so many different things. He was at the END conference we had there. He spoke to my sixth form in school. He delivered the Lord Mayor's annual peace lecture and spoke at the Hiroshima Day service, and he took part in local debates. In 2009, he was given the Coventry International Prize for Peace and Reconciliation, which is awarded every year on the anniversary of the bombing of Coventry. He was given it in recognition of a lifetime devoted to campaigning for peace, justice, and human rights, and was recognized as having influenced whole generations in their understanding of the terror of war and the urgency of peace. Richard's already put in the chat, and it's been mentioned, the fact that last year at Coventry University, he was awarded an honorary doctorate of letters. And it's incredibly significant that what he did at that time was to address the young people so powerfully in the way that we've already heard. Young people, please think for yourselves. Don't be swept along by whatever happens to be the propaganda of the day. Ask your own critical questions. Bruce always encouraged people, especially the young, to exercise their democratic right as global citizens to influence policy. He consistently offered a perspective based on moral principles, international law, and support for the United Nations. His work was based on a belief that human beings can create a world in which war becomes obsolete. At his incredible funeral on Monday, among the symbols placed on his coffin were very well-thumbed copies of the Psalms and the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. Pax Christi, England and Wales would not be the organisation it is today without the creative energy and enthusiasm and support of Bruce Kent since its early days in the 1960s. Courageously outspoken, deeply concerned about the injustices suffered by others, and working tirelessly for an end to nuclear weapons and militarism to achieve peace. He has made a difference that is impossible to measure. We shall miss his presence, his questioning interest, his challenges, his knowledge of history, and his wealth of experience, and of course his humour that never failed to lighten our gatherings. And I shall miss the very many occasions on which we found ourselves sitting on walls at demonstrations, at events, or in the middle of a walk, as we did when we went to the Flanders fields to visit the fields of war there that made such an impression on all of us that were there. But we would be sitting on walls as we were listening to people talking about it. We were at vigils together and services, and at so many other things, as so many others will recall. Bruce lived out his favourite quote from Catholic social teaching: "Peace is the fruit of anxious daily care to see that each person lives in justice as God intends." And we have that path to follow ourselves. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Anne Fair. And I have a great pleasure to announce the next speaker, Jeremy Coburn. I remember one impressive scene on the huge CND demonstration against nuclear weapons, when Bruce was staying on the stage and Jeremy comes on the stage and the two takes each other in the arms. And Bruce was saying, "Hi, Jeremy, you are one of my eldest friends." Jeremy, it's a great pleasure for me to give the floor now to you. Please.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you for arranging this call today in memory of Bruce. It still seems quite hard to understand that Bruce is no longer with us, because he's been a part of our lives for as long as I can remember. And I must have known Bruce for over 40 years, I guess, at meetings, demonstrations, marches, events. And for me, he was more than a figure in CND and a figure in the peace movement. He was a friend, he was a near neighbor, and he was very active in the local community where I live. He was a great activist at St. Mellitus Church, and I remember him asking me to get involved in a fundraising campaign for the church so that a lift could be installed so that people could go from the service to the crypt below and enjoy refreshments afterwards. And we had trouble raising the money for this lift. And so we approached Arsenal Football Club with a simple message: give us a lift. And they did. Bruce's charm worked even on Arsenal Football Club, and so it was his involvement in the community. And the last local event he came to was an open-air iftar supper organised by Finsbury Park Mosque to celebrate Eid, to enjoy or celebrate Ramadan, to enjoy the company of the local community. And Bruce was, of course, there, as he had always been there. And it was lovely that Mohammed Kosbar, the chair of Finsbury Park Mosque, came to the funeral service at St. Mellitus on Monday morning. Bruce did so much for our movement. He did it from total belief. He did it from his faith. He did it on behalf of Christians all over the world, but his faith knew no religious boundaries. He would work with any and every faith, and absolutely did. As General Secretary of CND in the 1980s, he saw what was a massive rebirth of CND, the growth of an anti-nuclear movement, the involvement of hundreds of thousands of people of all ages and pretty wide range of political and social opinions who joined in trying to oppose the introduction of Trident nuclear missiles to Britain, but also supporting the Greenham Common Camp and the women of Greenham. Bruce was very open in his support for all sections within CND and all other groups. And because of his religious status, because of his appearance, his age, his impish humor, he did absolutely brilliantly on the media. And was pointed out in the service the other day, in 1 year, Margaret Thatcher was named Woman of the Year and Bruce Man of the Year. I don't think they saw eye to eye on anything or agreed on anything, but it was a sense of humor, I guess, by those that did that nomination. What Bruce did was challenge the idea that security comes from arms, that security comes from weapons of mass destruction. And so he would always speak up for the victims of war, the victims of nuclear testing, the victims who are often forgotten. And we should now be thinking of the people of Afghanistan, 20 years of occupation. They've now been left with a devastated, impoverished, hungry country. That is what wars bring about. Bruce understood all that and said all that so clearly and so loudly. And the last speech I heard him make was against the war in Ukraine. It's against the war in Ukraine because it's wrong. It's simply wrong to invade another country. And that he made very, very clear. But he also said the response has to be peace, has to be an interlocutor who would help to bring about that peace, and has to be not rearmament, but ultimately much more disarmament. And so Britain proposing to increase defence expenditure to 2.5% of gross domestic product, other countries following suit, an increase in the number of nuclear warheads that this country has, an increase in nuclear warheads by the US, by Russia, by China, by France, isn't going to bring about peace, isn't going to bring about disarmament. And I think in Bruce's memory, we should remember this. He spoke up, whatever the consequences for him personally. He gave a message of peace when others were giving only a message of war. He used innovation, he used humor, he used moral imperatives to try to encourage people to go on a path of peace. And in his memory, that's what we must do. This autumn, in October, we're going to be planting a tree. We have the tree already. It's a hornbeam, one of the strongest, biggest, longest lasting, hardest trees you can get. And it's going to be there in Finsbury Park in memory of Bruce. Bruce, what a hero, what a friend, what a strategist, and what a terrible loss for our peace movement. But think of all the millions of people that were inspired by Bruce, the young people that became peace activists because of Bruce, the way he reached out to people across all the divides there are in this world. In his memory, that peace movement's only going to get bigger. Surely COVID, Ukraine, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, Yemen, Palestine, and so many other wars and disasters around the world have taught us that there has to be a different and a better way. Real security isn't the ability to kill each other. Real security is the ability to feed each other, to educate each other, to help each other through health crises. Bruce taught us all of that. I will desperately miss him. We will all desperately miss him. But it was our privilege to know him, to call him a friend, and to be inspired by his work. Rainer, thank you so much for all that you do and for inviting me onto this call today.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Jeremy. That was a very, very powerful tribute to Bruce, and I'm so glad that you're initiating the planting of the tree in Finsbury Park. It's a marvellous, marvellous thing to do. So now we're going to, before our final speaker, we're going to be looking at a series of photographs of Bruce. One of the things that C&D is doing is asking our members and supporters to send in photographs and memories to be part of our online exhibition. So what we're going to see now is a small selection of these pictures. So I'll just provide commentary if necessary, but here's Bruce in the 1980s, 1986, addressing a public meeting in Barnsley. That's a National Union of Miners meeting there. Next, yeah, this is Bruce on one of the many marches that he went on. This is the Lancaster C&D march. There he is with the local activist Anne Grenier. This is Bruce Kent with Joan Ruddock. She was the chair while Bruce was general secretary. They were an amazing team. She later became a Labour MP. This is Bruce. Well, that's what it says on the label there. That's at Chapel Cross nuclear power station. Of course, C&D is also opposed to nuclear power as well as nuclear weapons. Well, Bruce at a friend's house in Hemel Hempstead with a dog. This is Bruce in Northumberland. He helped to set up or revive the Northumbrians for Peace group there. This is at Molesworth. Molesworth was one of the two bases. Greenham Common and Molesworth were the bases that cruise missiles went to. There was a big peace camp there, very much a faith-based peace camp. I know that in 1985, I think it was, 1,500 police and troops tried to destroy the camp and move people on, but the vigils and protests continued there until the missiles were removed in the late 80s. That's also from Molesworth. You can see the crowd there. And this is Bruce at RAF at Burfield. Burfield is part of the factory where nuclear bombs are made at Aldermaston and Burfield. Yes, noting Bruce Arms, the pub, one of those warm beers. We have received some lovely photos from Bruce's family members. This is the caption here from Stuart Kent. His nephew is Bruce cheating at Monopoly in 2012. So it's a great enjoyer of life, our Bruce. Climbing Helvellyn, that's in the Lake District. Bruce climbed that mountain several times and wanted to do that again successfully in 2012. That's from the 80s. You can see the younger Bruce there in the middle. That was one of the big demonstrations. I think that's probably 1983, big demonstrations against crews. This is not quite sure where Hamilton is, but somewhere on the march, and that's a trade union banner, National Association of Local Government Officers. Yep, that's with a poster. Some very good images, actually. That was Bruce joining supporters for a community meal. So when he was out and about on marches, he didn't go and stay in hotels. He stayed with local supporters and friends. That's with Kate Dews. Many of you will know Kate Dews, I think, the great New Zealand activist. That's in Tavistock Square, I think just a few years ago. That's Baroness Jenny Jones, great anti-nuclear campaigner on the microphone, Bruce on the left there. That's Bruce at home in 2006. That's also with Kate Dews there. That's in the IPB office. Shame that Collins, I think, had to leave the call, but that's the IPB office 1994. There were many, many cartoons of Bruce. I mean, some very uncomplimentary and so on. But yeah, that's quite a nice one that captures him. And this is at Basingstoke, the last leg of the Long March, 1986. Ah, yes, with the poster about the war game, the suppressed documentary about the impact of nuclear war, which C&D showed around the country. Yeah, that's another Walking with Cumbrians for Peace, that's 1986. And that's 1980. Press conference in 1983. That's a great picture. Greeting the US Iowa in 1989 against crews, fantastic. That's at Downing Street at the time of the First Gulf War, protesting against that in 1990. Oh, yes. Now I had a little competition with my colleagues in the office. Who is this senior gentleman on the left? Well, I don't know if any of you know, but it's actually Philip Noel Baker, who was a Labour MP. He was the only person who's won both an Olympic medal and a Nobel Peace Prize. So there you are. He won a silver medal in athletics in 1920. And he was a great and multilateral anti-nuclear campaigner, founder of the World Disarmament movement alongside the great Fenner Brockway. So that person in the background sent in this photo. He's Steve Ashley, a great musician and singer from the 1980s, and he did a single which on the one side had him singing one of his popular songs, and on the other side a speech from Noel Baker and a speech from Bruce Kent. So I'd love to get a copy of that. And there they are again. And that's a great banner from one of the big demos. And that's one of the great early demos from the 1980s. And very, very strong peace contingents always on those demonstrations. Of course, that's from Westminster Christian C&D in the centre. And yeah, another of the great demonstrations. That's Bruce outside Aldermaston, Atomic Weapons Research Establishment there. Having a rest, taking a break on the Long March. Some of these photos are by David Rumsey, and he and Wendy Rumsey accompanied Bruce and supported him on many of the long marches. That's walking with the ex-services C&D banner, and of course Bruce was a member of ex-services C&D, having been a tank commander. Abingdon Peace Group, 1986. Well, thank you so much to people for sending in those marvellous photographs. And if you wish to see more, or if you wish indeed to submit your own photographs and memories, then we'd be delighted to receive them in the C&D office. So now I turn to welcome our final speaker, Shweta Chowdhury. Shweta is an activist in C&D and the Stop the War Coalition. She's also a scholar researching into the recent history of our movement, and she got to know Bruce well in recent years. Shweta, welcome, and over to you.
Hi, everyone. And I'd like to start by thanking Kate Hudson and our friends at the International Peace Bureau for giving me this opportunity to talk about our beloved friend and comrade Bruce Kent. And I also want to thank all the speakers for giving us an insight into Bruce's life and activities and how he touched the hearts of so many people with his virtues and kindness. Like Jeremy said, we last saw Bruce about 2.5 months ago at a street iftar in North London during Ramadan. He was waiting for Jeremy when I walked up to him to say hello, and I had the good fortune of having a very long chat with him. As always, he made me laugh, and he always had so many inspiring stories to share. I haven't made peace with the fact that I will never see him again and have those wonderful conversations. I will miss everything about him, and so will a lot of people. The sum of things Bruce did, thought, achieved, and changed, his complexity and his multitudes, none of them can be summed up in 5 minutes, so it's foolish for me to even try. But nonetheless, I'd love to share my experience of knowing him, and it's a privilege that I don't take for granted. I first met Bruce about a decade ago at a rally organized by the Stop the War Coalition and C&D. I was a volunteer then, and my first impression of him was that he was a very fine speaker and a funny one too. He was powerful, passionate, bright, and he spoke to the point. I believe he was in his 80s then, but he was as sharp and fierce as a person in their 20s or 30s. In the same year, I got a part-time job with Stop the War and soon became a national organizer. And this is when I started liaising with C&D and Bruce more frequently about meetings and demonstrations and protests. And soon I discovered that I wholeheartedly agreed with Bruce's vision of peace and his approach to peace building. I've heard Bruce speak at countless events since, and every single time he was consistently spellbinding. It's really not an exaggeration to say that listening to Bruce's speeches changed me. It crystallized in me the idea that peace wasn't just a subject matter of debate and reason, but of passion and conviction too. Bruce is also the most remarkably punctual person I've ever come across. In fact, Jeremy Corbyn once asked if Bruce was in the military because he was never late for anything, like ever. No matter how small or big the event was, he took it very seriously, and he'd always turn up at every public meeting, every demonstration, dot on time. It was really commendable. I don't think I need to reiterate his contribution to the anti-war and anti-nuclear movements. It's huge and it's immeasurable. There are so many organizations, including CND, Pax Christi, and the International Peace Bureau, even Stop the War, that would not be what they are today without Bruce's support and enthusiasm. There are many people who have cause to be grateful to Bruce for his campaigning, for leading a movement against nuclear weapons over decades, for challenging government policies over militarism and war, for supporting the cause and justice of Palestinians, and for his solidarity with the Muslim community against racism. But it's particularly important to reflect on the huge political influence he had on young activists, including me. It was through his tireless anti-war activities that Bruce became familiar to many people of my age. When he spoke against wars and nuclear weapons, he coupled genuine emotion with reason. It was the skill which made him such a powerful advocate for the movement. His arguments made you think, sometimes laugh, and occasionally they made the hairs on the back of your neck stand on end. And it's fair to say that Bruce inspired me like no other person and has played a key role in my political development. He inspired me to stand up for my convictions. The fact that he left the Catholic Church, an institution that was so important to him personally, and yet become a bigger political figure for it, and as well as the peace movement, says a lot about how incredibly powerful Bruce was. Bruce made the idea of peace seem so undeniably reasonable, humane, and obvious. It will be almost impossible to find his passion, intelligence, and wit. It was these qualities, along with his determination to always speak truth to power, which made him such a legendary figure. He will be remembered for the incredible work he did across decades, for his principles and standing up for what he believed in, and for his encouragement to a whole movement, both on the mass stage, but also to countless individuals like me, to whom he was and always will be an inspiration. Like Jeremy said, the peace movement without Bruce will be an impoverished one. However, his legacy will live on through our campaigns for peace. Thank you again for allowing me to be a part of this event. Solidarity.
Thank you, Sveta, for these remarkable comments to Bruce. And I can imagine how much you enjoyed, like all of us, to meet him, to work with him, to speak with him, and to laugh with him. You know, at the end of such a meeting, I think it is not time to make a summary. It is time for all of us to think about what we heard. And I would like to close the event with one sentence. Dear Bruce, we will not forget you, never, and will continue fighting for a world without nuclear weapons and wars. This is your legacy. We will work for, in the sense you have worked your whole life. Thank you all for joining the meeting today, and I'm sure that we all will meet each other again somewhere in the world, and that we will continue remembering Bruce Kent in fight in the sense of his will for a better justice world. Thank you so much. And the final word is to Kate.
Oh, thank you. I can't follow those words, Rainer. Absolutely 100%. We'll all do everything we can to continue to achieve those goals of peace and disarmament and justice that we shared with Bruce. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.